8 catapults, 8,000 warriors, one dying king on a stretcher. In November 1183, the most powerful Muslim general since the Prophet's companions, commanding elite forces that had crushed armies across the Middle East, fled from a teenager who couldn't even walk. This is how a blind, paralyzed leper king forced the mighty Saladin into one of history's most humiliating retreats. The survival of Christianity in the Holy Land hung by a thread. One dying king versus 8,000 warriors. Those were the odds. By the end of this video, you'll understand how physical weakness became psychological warfare's ultimate weapon. You'll discover 3 shocking truths: why Saladin abandoned a siege he was winning, how a wedding feast became a weapon of war, and the moment a stretcher-bound king terrified Islam's greatest champion. Stones crashed against ancient walls while wedding music mixed with war drums. Inside Kerak castle, nobles danced as death rained from the sky. If Kerak fell, the road to Jerusalem lay open. The last great Crusader fortress in Transjordan would crumble, and with it, Christianity's defensive line. But here's what defies explanation. How did a king who couldn't see or walk inspire such fear? What made Saladin choose humiliation over certain victory? Why did sworn enemies exchange gifts during a brutal siege? Baldwin IV couldn't hold a sword. His flesh was rotting. Leprosy had stolen his sight, his feeling, his very humanity. Yet Saladin, conqueror of Egypt, unifier of Islam, the general who made Crusader armies tremble, fled at his approach. The statistics are staggering. 8,000 seasoned warriors, with the most advanced siege equipment of the age, retreated from 4,000 exhausted crusaders, led by a king who had to be carried on a litter. This wasn't a battle. It was a humiliation that would echo through centuries. To understand this impossible moment, when reputation alone won wars and dying kings terrified healthy generals, let me transport you to a kingdom ruled by a corpse. If stories of impossible victories and legendary rulers fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic battles from history's darkest hours. Ring the notification bell to never miss how the weakest changed the world. Now, let me transport you to the scorching deserts of the Holy Land. The year was 1183. The Crusader kingdoms clung to survival like a drowning man to driftwood. For 80 years, Christian knights had held these desert fortresses, but now their grip was failing, and at the center of this dying kingdom sat a dying king. At 13, Baldwin had discovered spots on his arm that felt nothing. Not pain, not pressure, not heat. The diagnosis came like a death sentence. Leprosy, the disease that made men living corpses. Medieval medicine knew no cure. The boy who should have ruled for decades would be lucky to see 25. But Baldwin IV refused to surrender to decay. Crowned at 13, he learned to rule from a throne his rotting body could barely occupy. They called him the Leper King, but his subjects saw something else, a miracle of willpower, a testament that strength came not from muscle but from spirit. Across the desert, another legend was rising. Saladin, Yusuf ibn Ayyub, to his men, had done the impossible. He'd unified Egypt and Syria, ended decades of Muslim civil war, and turned fractured emirates into a single fist aimed at the Crusader throat. The Sword of Faith, they called him. The champion who would reclaim Jerusalem for Islam. What happened next shocked both armies. Between these titans stood a wild card, Reynaud of Châtillon, lord of Kerak castle, where Baldwin embodied noble suffering and Saladin represented unified purpose. Reynaud was pure chaos. The mad wolf of Kerak had spent 16 years in Muslim prisons, emerging with a hatred that burned hotter than desert sand. Reynaud's provocations would spark a war that would echo for centuries. In 1182, he'd done the unthinkable, launched ships on the Red Sea to raid Mecca itself. For 500 years, no Christian had dared threaten Islam's holiest sites. Reynaud didn't just dare, he reveled in the sacrilege. Muslim pilgrims died, sacred ports burned. Saladin's response was inevitable. The man who'd shown mercy to enemies swore a blood oath. Reynaud would die by his own hand. But Kerak Castle stood between oath and fulfillment, a fortress that had never fallen, perched on cliffs that made assault nearly impossible. The Crusader states were fractured. Baldwin's leprosy had progressed until he could barely sign documents. Regent after regent grabbed for power. Jerusalem's nobles feuded while Islam unified. Only Baldwin's iron will held the kingdom together. But even iron corrodes. By autumn 1183, the pieces were in place. Saladin had assembled the largest army seen in a generation. Baldwin lay dying in Jerusalem, blind in one eye, paralyzed below the waist. And at Kerak, Reynald prepared to host a wedding that would become legendary for all the wrong reasons. The marriage of Isabella of Jerusalem to Humphrey of Toron should have been a celebration of alliance. Instead, it would become bait for the trap of the century. One man's greed, one fortress's defiance, and one dying king's determination would collide in a siege that defied every rule of medieval warfare. What Saladin didn't know would cost him everything. What Baldwin couldn't do would somehow save his kingdom. But in autumn 1183, all these tensions would explode at the worst possible moment. Kerak Castle rose like a stone fist from the desert floor. Built on a rocky spur 900 feet above the valley, its walls stretched 30 feet thick, impervious to conventional siege weapons. For 40 years, it had dominated the King's Highway, the ancient trade route from Damascus to Egypt. Every merchant caravan, every pilgrim group, every army had to pass beneath its shadow. Inside those mighty walls, November 1183 brought unprecedented celebration. The wedding of Isabella of Jerusalem to Humphrey of Toron wasn't just a marriage, it was a political statement. The union would bind two of the kingdom's most powerful families, strengthening the fractured Crusader cause. But here's where it gets insane. Saladin's intelligence network, the finest in the medieval world, reported something irresistible. Kerak's defenders were distracted, wine flowed freely, guards celebrated instead of watching. The fortress's greatest strength, its isolation, had become weakness. Most of the kingdom's nobles were trapped inside, drunk on wedding wine. The army Saladin assembled defied comprehension. 8,000 men materialized from the desert, Egyptian Mamluks trained from childhood for war, Kurdish cavalry who'd followed Saladin since his early campaigns, Syrian infantry hardened by decades of conflict, and most terrifying of all, specialist engineers from Damascus with their infernal machines. Those machines would write history. 8 massive catapults, each requiring 50 men to operate, capable of hurling 200-pound stones 300 yards. The trebuchets stood 50 feet tall, their counterweights heavier than anything previously deployed in the Holy Land.
Each could launch devastating projectiles every 3 minutes, a rate of fire that would turn Kerak's walls to dust. But inside Kerak's walls, something bizarre was happening. As Saladin's army darkened the horizon, as the first siege engines rolled into position, the wedding feast continued. Nobles danced while engineers calculated trajectories. Musicians played while Muslim cavalry encircled the castle. The contrast was surreal. Celebration inside, annihilation outside. What Saladin didn't know would cost him everything. High atop David's Tower in Jerusalem, 65 miles north, a different kind of preparation was underway. The kingdom's beacon system, a chain of signal fires stretching from the Dead Sea to the Mediterranean, stood ready. One flame could alert the entire realm in hours, faster than any messenger. The forces gathering represented more than armies. They embodied the conflict's very soul. On one side, Saladin's unified host, disciplined, motivated by both faith and the promise of plunder. They'd come to erase the insult of Reynald's raids, to open the road to Jerusalem, to prove Muslim arms supreme. On the other, a wedding party about to become a desperate garrison. Knights who donned silk for the ceremony would soon wear mail. Ladies who danced at the feast would tend wounded on the walls, and somewhere between celebration and catastrophe, they would discover if stone walls and noble blood could withstand the storm about to break. The mathematics of siege warfare were brutal. Kerak held perhaps 1,000 defenders, including the wedding guests. Food stores could last months, but water depended on cisterns that siege engines could crack. Against them came 8,000 attackers with supplies for a lengthy siege and the tools to reduce any fortress to rubble. Here's the detail historians still can't explain. As the sun set on November 19th, with Muslim forces taking position, a messenger rode from Kerak. Not to summon help, that would come later, but to deliver wedding gifts to Saladin's camp. The gesture would trigger a response that revealed the strange chivalry governing this brutal age. By dawn, the pieces were set. The greatest Muslim army since the First Crusade surrounded Christianity's easternmost bastion. Inside, wedding guests realized their celebration had become a trap. And in Jerusalem, a king who couldn't rise from bed would soon attempt the impossible. The stage was set for one of history's strangest sieges, where wedding feasts and war machines, chivalry and savagery, weakness and strength would collide in ways that still defy belief. Then, on November 20th, the first stone flew. Dawn on November 20th brought thunder without clouds. The first catapult stone, 200 pounds of carved limestone, crashed into Kerak's outer wall with a sound that shook the mountain. Every 3 minutes, another stone followed. The siege of Kerak had begun, and with it, a countdown to catastrophe. Inside the castle, wedding guests scrambled from silk to steel. The transformation was jarring. Noble ladies who danced all night now hauled water to the walls. Knights nursed wine headaches while donning armor. Humphrey of Tehran, the young groom, found his wedding night interrupted by calls to arms. But that's when everything changed. Lady Stephanie of Millie, Kerak's chatelaine and mother of the groom, did something that stunned both armies. As stones crashed around her, she ordered servants to prepare platters from the wedding feast. The finest dishes, roasted lamb, honey cakes, wine from Jerusalem's vineyards, were arranged with care. Then she did the unthinkable. Under a flag of truce, she sent the platters to Saladin's tent with a note. From one parent to another, may you share our joy even in war. The gesture transcended the battlefield. Here, with death raining from his machines, the mother of the groom offered hospitality to her would-be destroyer. In that moment, the sword of faith proved he was more than a conqueror. Saladin received the gifts with grace that shocked his commanders. His response would echo through centuries. Tell Lady Stephanie that I accept her kindness. Ask which tower houses the newlyweds. When told, he ordered his engineers to spare that section of wall. I will not let war disturb love's celebration, he declared. But chivalry wouldn't save them from starvation. The mathematics of siege were inexorable. Each day, Kerak's 1,000 defenders consumed 2,000 pounds of food. Water cisterns, cracked by relentless bombardment, leaked precious supplies into desert sand. Saladin's engineers, masters of their craft, identified every weakness. Mining operations began, tunneling toward foundations that had stood since Roman times. Then came news that changed everything. On November 25th, a lone rider broke through Muslim lines. His message was simple but earth-shaking. The king knows, the king comes. In Jerusalem, Baldwin IV had received word of Kerak's plight. The implications defied logic. A king who couldn't walk would march to war. What happened next defied medical possibility. Baldwin's condition had deteriorated beyond what should have allowed movement. Blind in one eye, paralyzed in 3 limbs, flesh rotting from advanced leprosy, he required constant care just to survive. Yet when news of Kerak arrived, witnesses describe a transformation. I will go to them. 4 words that shouldn't have been possible. Baldwin's counselors protested. The kingdom needed its king alive, not dead on some foolish relief march. But Baldwin's remaining eye blazed with purpose. that transcended physical decay. "Prepare my litter," he commanded. "If I die advancing, not retreating." The decision moment revealed why men followed a corpse. In a world that valued physical prowess above all, Baldwin redefined strength. He couldn't hold a sword, but he could hold a kingdom together. He couldn't ride, but he could lead. The paradox of the leper king, weakness as the ultimate weapon, was about to face its greatest test. Nobody could have predicted what happened at dawn on November 28th. The army that assembled in Jerusalem defied description. 4,000 men gathered not behind a warrior king, but behind a litter carrying what looked like a corpse. Templars, those warrior monks who welcomed death, knelt before Baldwin's ruined form. Hospitallers put aside their rivalry with the Templars. Secular knights who'd questioned Baldwin's rule now competed for the honor of carrying his litter. The mobilization revealed the kingdom's desperation and determination. Every able-bodied knight in Jerusalem answered the call. They stripped garrisons, emptied treasuries, conscripted anyone who could hold a spear. This wasn't just a relief force. It was the kingdom's last gamble, led by a king who epitomized impossibility. But fate had other plans. As Baldwin's army prepared to march, Saladin tightened his grip on Kerak. The bombardment intensified. Stones fell like hail. Greek fire burned through the night. Mining operations reached critical depth. Inside, defenders rationed water by the cup, counted arrows like gold coins, wondered if relief was rumor or reality. What the scouts reported defied belief. On December 1st, as Muslim engineers prepared for final assault, watchmen spotted something impossible on the northern horizon.
A dust cloud too large for raiders, too organized for refugees. Then came confirmation that stopped hearts in both camps. The royal banner of Jerusalem approached, and beneath it, carried like a sacred relic, came Baldwin IV. The impossible march had begun. A king who couldn't stand would traverse 65 miles of hostile terrain in December's bitter cold. Behind him marched the last hope of a dying kingdom. Ahead waited Islam's greatest general with every advantage: numbers, position, momentum. Yet somehow, in defiance of logic, medicine, and military science, the leper king advanced. As dawn broke on December 1st, the impossible happened. But then the calculus of war shifted entirely. Baldwin emerged from Jerusalem's gates on a litter draped in royal purple, and the kingdom's beacon system exploded to life. The flame atop David's tower pierced the night, visible for 50 miles across the Judean hills. Within hours, watchfires blazed from peak to peak. Bethlehem, Hebron, down to the Dead Sea's desolate shores. The leper king was marching. Saladin's scouts brought reports that defied reason. 4,000 crusaders marched behind a corpse, they said. The Muslim commander's war council erupted in debate. Some called it desperation. Others saw divine madness. But veterans who'd faced Baldwin before fell silent. They remembered Montjazard, where this same dying king had shattered Saladin's army against all odds. The statistical shock was overwhelming. Baldwin's force moved with impossible speed. In 48 hours, they covered terrain that took healthy armies 3 days. The explanation lay in desperation transformed to purpose. These weren't just soldiers, they were men following a miracle. Templars sang hymns as they marched. Hospitallers, sworn to heal, now raced to kill. Every man understood. If Baldwin could march while dying, they could endure mere exhaustion. But here's where it gets even more incredible. The army's composition revealed the kingdom's final gamble. 500 Templar knights, men who slept in their armor, who took vows of poverty and chastity, who viewed death in battle as guaranteed paradise. 300 Hospitallers, equally fanatic, equally deadly. 1,000 secular knights representing every noble house still loyal to the crown. 2,200 infantry and sergeants, the backbone of crusader armies. Behind them all, carried on a litter that jolted with each step, Baldwin IV endured agony that would have killed lesser men. Blood seeped through bandages with each movement. Physicians rode alongside, knowing their skills were useless against divine will. The king who couldn't feel his limbs somehow felt his kingdom's pain and pressed onward. But then nature itself entered the conflict. December brought unseasonable storms. Rain turned roads to mud. Wind drove sand into eyes and armor joints. Both armies struggled, but for Baldwin's forces, already pushing beyond human limits, each mile became torture. Yet they pressed on, driven by the spectacle of their dying king, refusing to yield. Perspective shifted to Kerak's walls, where defenders saw salvation approaching. The beacon fires had announced Baldwin's march, transforming despair to fierce hope. Men who'd counted remaining arrows now fought with renewed fury. Women who'd rationed water now poured it freely on defenders. The castle that had seemed doomed suddenly bristled with defiance. What happened next shocked both armies. Saladin's engineers achieved breakthrough. The outer wall's foundation cracked. Stones tumbled. A breach opened. Muslim infantry massed for assault. Victory seemed moments away. Inside Kerak, Reynald himself led the desperate defense, the mad wolf fighting with cornered fury. This was the crisis moment. If Kerak fell before Baldwin arrived, the march meant nothing. The sensory chaos was overwhelming. Greek fire's acrid smoke mixed with limestone dust from crumbling walls. The metallic tang of blood competed with wedding perfume still lingering in the great hall. Screams of wounded echoed against hymns from desperate defenders, and cutting through it all, the rhythmic crash of catapult stones, Saladin's mechanical heartbeat of destruction. In 48 hours, Baldwin covered terrain that took healthy men 3 days. The forced march entered military legend. Knights discarded unnecessary armor. Infantry abandoned supply wagons. Everything non-essential was sacrificed for speed. They marched through night, navigated by beacon fires and desperate prayers. Men collapsed, were loaded onto horses, recovered, and marched again. Then physics itself seemed to take Baldwin's side. December 3rd brought clear weather and favorable wind. Dust clouds from the marching army became visible from unprecedented distance. Muslim scouts reported the impossible. The Crusader host was only 1 day away, not 3 as expected. Saladin faced a commander's nightmare, caught between castle and relief force. This single decision would echo for 800 years. Saladin convened his war council as Baldwin's army crested the hills above Kerak. The tactical situation was clear. Muslim forces outnumbered Christians 2-1, but geometry favored the defenders. To maintain the siege meant fighting on 2 fronts. To turn and face Baldwin meant abandoning expensive siege equipment. To retreat meant humiliation. The Egyptian faction argued for battle. "We are 8,000 against 4,000, led by a dying boy." Syrian commanders, who'd faced Baldwin before, urged caution. That dying boy destroyed 26,000 at Montjazard with 500 knights. The Kurds wanted to maintain siege positions. "Let them come to us. We hold the stronger ground." Meanwhile, 50 miles away, the impossible became reality. Ships burned in Egyptian ports. Reynald's raiders, taking advantage of Saladin's absence, struck the Nile Delta. Every day Saladin remained at Kerak. His empire's extremities grew more vulnerable. Alexandria's garrison sent urgent messages: "Return, or Egypt falls to chaos." But then came the moment that defined both leaders. As December 4th dawned, Baldwin's army crested the final ridge. The leper king's banner, the cross of Jerusalem on white silk, caught morning light. Below stretched the valley of Kerak, Saladin's army arrayed like a steel crescent around the battered fortress. The psychological moment had arrived. 2 armies faced each other across 2 miles of broken ground. On one side, Islam's greatest general commanding superior numbers, holding superior position, with momentum from weeks of successful siege. On the other, a dying king on a litter, leading exhausted men who'd marched beyond human endurance. But wait, it gets even more incredible. What followed wasn't a battle but a staring contest that would determine the fate of kingdoms. For 6 hours, neither army moved. The tactical chess match played out in both commanders' minds. Saladin knew that attacking uphill against desperate crusaders meant horrific casualties. Baldwin knew his exhausted force couldn't survive a prolonged engagement. The real battle was just beginning. Not of swords but of wills. Who would blink first? The healthy general with every advantage, or the dying king with nothing but reputation? In military textbooks, the answer was obvious. In reality, something extraordinary was about to happen. What Saladin did next shocked both armies. As noon approached, Muslim forces began a maneuver that sent ripples of disbelief through their ranks. Siege engines, too valuable to abandon, began rolling away from Kerak's walls. Infantry formed defensive squares. Cavalry screened the withdrawal. The mighty Saladin, who'd never retreated from inferior forces, was withdrawing. In that instant, physics gave way to psychology. The dying king's mere presence had achieved what strength could not. Reputation became a weapon sharper than any sword. The shadow of Montgizar, where boy King Baldwin had destroyed Saladin's mighty host, loomed larger than present reality. Sometimes, warriors flee not from what is, but from what might be. The moment of decision revealed war's deepest truth. Victory belongs not to the strongest, but to whoever makes their enemy believe they cannot win. Baldwin, carried on a litter, blind and paralyzed, had made Islam's greatest champion blink. In that moment, reputation became a weapon sharper than any sword. The standoff stretched through December 4th's blazing noon. For 6 eternal hours, 12,000 men waited in armor under desert sun, neither army daring to move first. Crusader knights swayed from exhaustion. Muslim cavalry horses stamped with impatience. Between them lay 2 miles of broken ground that might as well have been an ocean. Then, like a tide reversing against nature, 8,000 of Islam's finest warriors turned from their prey. The withdrawal began with eerie precision. Saladin's commanders, whatever their private thoughts, executed orders with professional skill. Rearguard cavalry covered the precious siege engines as they groaned away from walls they'd nearly breached. 47 days of siege, 300 Muslim casualties, tons of ammunition expended, all for nothing. The Egyptian infantry formed squares, spears bristling outward, daring the Crusaders to attack their retreat. But that's when everything changed one final time. Baldwin, raised on his litter to witness the moment, gave no order to pursue. The Templars, bred for battle, stayed their swords. This wasn't mercy. It was calculation. Baldwin's exhausted army couldn't catch fresh troops. More importantly, the psychological victory was complete. Why risk turning triumph into disaster? Inside Kerak's battered walls, the scene defied description. As Muslim standards disappeared into southern dust clouds, defenders couldn't process their salvation. Men who'd rationed last arrows now wept openly. Women who'd prepared for slavery emerged from hiding. The wedding couple, young Humphrey and Isabella, stood atop the walls, their union blessed by the strangest wedding gift imaginable: survival. Then came the revelation that changed everything. As Baldwin's litter passed through gates his enemy couldn't breach, the castle's defenders witnessed something beyond comprehension. Their savior couldn't stand. The king who'd driven off Saladin had to be lifted from his litter like an infant. Yet from this broken flesh had come salvation. The personal moments that followed revealed medieval warfare's human cost. Knights who'd carried Baldwin's litter collapsed where they stood. Physicians rushed to the king, finding his condition deteriorated beyond their worst fears. The march had likely shortened his already brief life expectancy, but when someone mentioned this, Baldwin's remaining eye blazed with purpose. Better to die saving my people than to live watching them perish. The reunions mixed joy with sobering reality. Families separated by siege walls embraced. The wedding feast, interrupted by war, resumed with desperate celebration. But everyone understood. This was temporary reprieve, not lasting peace. Saladin would return. The kingdom's weakness had been exposed even in victory. Reynald of Chatillon, the mad wolf whose provocations had triggered everything, showed no humility in salvation. While others thanked God and Baldwin, Reynold boasted of his defiance. "Let Saladin come again," he declared. "Kerak has weathered worse storms." His arrogance would echo through time. In 4 years, Saladin would personally behead him after the catastrophe of Hattin. The immediate statistics told a stark story. Kerak's walls bore over 2,000 impact marks from catapult stones. Food stores were nearly exhausted. Water cisterns leaked from a dozen cracks. Without Baldwin's intervention, the castle would have fallen within days. The narrowness of salvation sobered even seasoned warriors. Saladin's retreat to Damascus revealed the political cost of military prudence. Commanders who'd urged battle now questioned their leader's courage. The army that had seemed invincible was intact but demoralized. They'd fled not from defeat but from the possibility of defeat. Somehow, that seemed worse. Resources spent on the failed siege could have conquered smaller targets. Political capital, carefully accumulated, was squandered. Individual stories illuminated the moment's magnitude. A Mamluk warrior, trained since childhood for victory, wept with shame at retreating from a carried king. A Templar knight, sworn to seek death in battle, found himself praising God for bloodless victory. The contradictions of holy war, mercy and massacre, chivalry and savagery, crystallized in this strange triumph. What followed would haunt military textbooks forever. Baldwin's victory at Kerak entered legend, but legends obscure truth. No swords had crossed, no heroic charge had swept the field. A dying king's reputation had won a psychological battle that saved a physical fortress. Military theorists would debate for centuries. Was this genius or luck? Strategy or providence? The deeper implications emerged slowly. Baldwin had won time, nothing more. His kingdom remained outnumbered, divided, dependent on a king who might die any day. Saladin had lost face, not capability. His armies remained intact, his resources vast, his determination undimmed. Both commanders understood. Kerak was intermission, not conclusion. But this victory would cast shadows longer than anyone imagined. In saving Kerak, Baldwin had demonstrated that will could triumph over strength, that reputation could replace physical power. He'd also exhausted his last reserves. The march to Kerak was the Leper King's final great exertion. Future crises would find him bedridden, unable to repeat this miracle. As December 1183 ended, 2 great leaders retreated to their capitals. Saladin to plan revenge, Baldwin to face his approaching death. The siege of Kerak had ended not with triumph but with postponement. In that strange space between victory and defeat, between weakness and strength, the future of the Holy Land hung suspended. But this victory would cast shadows longer than anyone imagined. The long-term consequences of Kerak rippled through history like stones in still water. Baldwin had bought his kingdom 4 precious years, time measured not in seasons but in heartbeats of a dying realm. When Saladin returned in 1184, the same pattern repeated. Baldwin's shadow, carried on a litter from Jerusalem, again drove the mighty conqueror away. Even proximity to the Leper King carried psychological weight that transcended military logic. But here's the detail historians still can't explain.
After Baldwin's death in 1185, aged just 24, Kerak's impregnability evaporated. The same walls that had withstood Saladin's greatest effort fell in 1188 to a smaller force. Without Baldwin's supernatural presence, stone and mortar proved merely mortal. The fortress that had seemed eternal surrendered after a year's siege, its defenders negotiating terms Baldwin would never have accepted. The historical significance extends beyond military annals. Baldwin's stand at Kerak represented the last great victory of the Crusader kingdoms, not of arms, but of will. After him came the disaster of Hattin, the loss of Jerusalem, the slow extinction of Christian power in the East. He was the final king to make Saladin hesitate, the last crusader whose name alone could turn back armies. Consider the philosophical implications. In an age that worshipped physical prowess, Baldwin redefined power. like Churchill rallying Britain with words while London burned, or Roosevelt governing from a wheelchair while democracy fought for survival, Baldwin proved that true strength transcends flesh. His leprosy, which should have disqualified him from leadership, became his strange qualification. Who better to lead the doomed than the dying? The modern parallels are striking. In our age of overwhelming force, of smart bombs and drone strikes, Baldwin reminds us that psychological warfare remains paramount. Reputation, determination, the willingness to attempt the impossible, these intangibles still outweigh material advantages. Every underdog victory, every David versus Goliath moment echoes Baldwin's litter approaching Kerak. The ultimate irony tastes bitter across centuries. Kerak fell in 1188, but only after Baldwin's death proved the kingdom's mortality. Reynald, whose provocations Baldwin had covered, finally met Saladin's sword, beheaded personally by the Sultan after Hattin. The kingdom Baldwin had preserved with his dying body survived him by mere months. Yet in those 4 years between Kerak and his death, he achieved immortality. This is where legend separates from history. Saladin learned profound lessons from his humiliation. He returned more patient, more strategic, willing to wait for Baldwin's inevitable death. The general who'd fled from reputation became the conqueror who retook Jerusalem with minimal bloodshed. In strange ways, Baldwin's victory at Kerak created the Saladin whom history remembers, not just as conqueror, but as exemplar of chivalry. The closing truth echoes through 8 centuries. 8,000 warriors fled from one dying king because in war, the mind conquers before the sword. Physical power means nothing if the enemy believes themselves already defeated. Baldwin understood this. On a litter, blind and paralyzed, he wielded the ultimate weapon, the absolute refusal to accept reality's verdict. Baldwin IV died at 24, but in those brief years, he achieved immortality. Not through conquest, he never expanded his kingdom. Not through glory, he knew only suffering. But through sheer will, he proved that even death, properly directed, could defeat life. At Kerak in 1183, weakness humiliated strength, disease conquered health, and a dying king's shadow grew longer than any army's sword. Some victories transcend battle, some legends transcend truth, and sometimes, just sometimes, refusing to surrender redefines what victory means.